All right. We're going to continue our series today on courageous living. And I know that for all of us, we have moments that are challenging, that are difficult, and require courage. And courage isn't the thought that we don't have fear, or we don't have doubts, or we don't have those challenges that we go through, but it's harnessing that fear and making the right decisions, and especially in context of our faith, what God has called us to do. And so we've been looking at someone in the Bible, the prophet Elijah, and we've been looking at his life and why he was someone who lived courageously. He didn't always get it right. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was someone who took continued steps in following God's plan for his life. And all of us, we have decisions on a regular basis, whether we do it the way we want to do it or we follow God's plan. And just to recap the story so far, for those who are joining us for the first time, I'll just give you the pleasure of hearing where we're at. Yes? So it stopped raining in Israel at this time, and it's a result of Elijah's prayer for it to stop raining. And this is because of the sin of King Ahab and of Israel rejecting God, being the one true God. And so God led Elijah to a ravine where he was to be fed by ravens, and there was a brook of water that he was to drink from. And that was going perfectly well until the brook dried up. And as we looked last week, God led him then to a widow, where the widow was to take care of him and to supply his needs. And she was courageous to give him the food, and her and her son take the leftovers. And through that provision, or through that step of faith, they were provided for. The bit of the story we didn't look at last week is, and the tail end of that passage is, the boy dies. And the very first resurrection we see in the Bible, Elijah prays, and that boy is raised to life. And so that is where the story is up to the moment. So when we start to look, 3.5 years go by and there is no rain. Now just imagine 3.5 years of no rain in this area. Can you imagine how dry it would be if in Canada, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it did not rain for 3.5 years? It would be so parched. There are parts of the world that are like that today. In chapter 18, verse 2, it says, "Now the famine was severe," because if there's no rain, nothing's growing, right? No rain, nothing's growing. So the famine was severe. And one of the things, just before we look at what we're going to read today, sometimes it requires famine in our lives, and I mean in a spiritual sense, things to get really dry before we get desperate, before we get serious. And sometimes we can live life a long time doing whatever we want, and sometimes it's in those moments of drought that our attention is focused on what really matters. Now God says to Elijah, it's time. And so this is where we pick up the story. We're going to do a little bit of scripture reading this morning. So if you didn't do your Bible reading before you came to church, hey, we're going to do it together. That's right, because you're in church, and you're there, and you're going to listen. All right. But we're going to also have it on the screen so you can follow along. Here we go. You ready? Okay, Tim's ready. That's good. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, this is Ahab, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" That's a great, "How are you doing?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your family, your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophet left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophet choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull and put it on wood and not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire is God." Then all the people said, "What you said is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull and that was given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder." He said, "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's in deep thought or busy or traveling." "Maybe he's asleep and must be awakened." So they shouted louder, slashing themselves with swords and spears, as were their customs. Good thing our worship isn't quite like that, isn't it? You might not want to come to church. Until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. I just want to pause here for a moment. We'll just recap it. There was this great showdown of who was really God. Who was really God? And it was a 450-1 odds. Time to see, time to really lay it out. Are you serving the true God, or am I serving the true God? It's a bold move, a courageous move, I would think. I'm sure most of us in the room would be a bit timid to lay our faith so much on the line as this. But it was a time to see who was really God and to stop being double-minded. Sometimes we can live like this as well, not maybe intentionally, but we can be double-minded. We have a foot in each camp. We might fly the flag of Christianity, but actually there's a bit of the world or a bit of following other things that are also part of our life. And the question was, who was really worth following? What was really worth giving your all to? Who was really worth it all? Who was worth it all? And so the prophets started first, and nothing happens. And so, as one would expect, because they were worshiping a false god who wasn't really a god at all. And Elijah taunts them and step it up a notch, to maybe he's asleep, maybe he's traveling, maybe something else is going on. Nothing happens. I think in some ways there's a picture of humanity, people trying to find their purpose, fulfillment without a God. And you can work harder, you can go to the extremes, you can do the most holidays, the most trips, you can win awards, acclamations, you can have a home, and you can have success, and you can have everything. You can pursue it with such vigor. You can approach life with your all, and at the end of the day, there's no one there answering. One of the things I found, and I'm sure for some of you, you may have discovered this as well, even in our time of COVID. If I can just bring up COVID just for a moment. I hate to do it. It's almost like a bad word. But I remember that sense of, you can be working so hard. We had friends that had businesses, and everyone was doing their very best and pursuing these great things. And overnight, that God in which you were giving your all to could not answer you. The job could not supply when suddenly it ceased operating. It wasn't going to meet your needs. Those who were in health tragedy, the success, the accolades, the education, whatever was the God, could not answer that health need. It was a lifeless God. And yet so much of our lives are like this. I know sometimes we can look at these Old Testament stories and disconnect because we don't worship, some statue or whatever, but we do worship things. Anything that takes that place of Lord of our life, something that we bow to, that we give our all to, that we surrender to, we make decisions around, where it becomes number one. Even sports can be our number one in this life. And yet at the end of the day, I want to just tell you something. It's a small g God that will never answer you in your time of need. Never. Your money in your bank account will never answer you when you have a health crisis. You can't have enough money. You can't have enough success when the bottom of your life or relationships fall apart. It doesn't matter. Those things don't matter. And that's the one thing about life. We can pursue and give our all to things that don't matter. And we can be double-minded, and we can kind of have our feet in two different directions, two different camps. And again, this story, this context was there was a drought for 3.5 years to get the nation's attention. Sometimes we go through difficulty, and I don't want to say that every tragedy or every challenge we go through is a result of an act of God to get our attention, but sometimes it is. Sometimes there's a moment where we need to be aware there's only one God, and it isn't the thing that we're serving. I've met athletes that had given their all to a sport only to have an injury that ended it all. You see, it's such a fine line when we're giving our heart and our soul to something that will never give us life. Nothing in this world will give us life. And so Elijah takes this bold move of putting it all on the line. And I think that's a challenge for us. If we were to put what we're living for on the line in relationship, in contrast to a relationship with God, what will win? And so in a very practical way, in a very obvious way, there was, okay, we're going to prepare these two sacrifices. You call out to God, your God first, and we'll see if God will answer by fire. Because if it's really God, and who you're serving is really there, fire will come and consume the sacrifice. It seems like a logical outcome for a supernatural power, correct? Well, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Well, that's where we're at so far in the story. So we're going to pick it up in verse 30. It says, Then Elijah said to all the people, Come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descending from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. He said to them, Fill 4 large jars with water. Remember, there's a drought. Fill 4 large jars of water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said. And they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are the God of Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so that the people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and it licked up the water in the trench. Then all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Then Elijah commanded them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Elijah sets this example that we can follow in our own lives, to see God move in our lives, to see him move through us. And one of the first things that Elijah does is he restores the relationship. And what I mean by that is he repairs the altar. This is an Old Testament time. And God was to be put back into the position of being first place. That there were no other gods to be taken that role of God being God. And the altar was a physical demonstration of what had taken place spiritually. Because as we read, the altar had been torn down. It had been fallen into disrepair. And so what was a nation that was all in, they were following God, they were all in. But as time moved on and as hearts pulled away, the altar, the sense of relationship and commitment to following God became dismantled, became secondary, no longer operational. Our walk with God may have had a similar example. Maybe in the past, if you look at your life, maybe in the past, you were someone who was very much on fire for God. You were someone, if you look back maybe your teenage years or your young adult years or maybe last year, you were someone who was all in. You were really impassioned to go after what God wanted of your life. You were saying, God, here am I, send me. You were that person. But then other things had kind of crept in over time, and that altar, your heart, your willingness to be the living sacrifice, to be the person on the line, and saying, God, here am I. Actually, other things took that place. And although there's maybe a motion of a relationship, actually the heart of it isn't there anymore. We see it even in Revelation, that first love that becomes no longer the first love. Other things become the first love and take priority. And so one of the first things Elijah does is he repairs the altar of the Lord. He repairs it. He recommits in a practical way that actually this place of commitment and sacrifice and giving our all in worship to God is going to be restored. It's a starting point. And I think if we're going to see God do something in and through our lives, it starts with a restored relationship with him. To just leave this building and say, I'm going to be all in, woo, party with Jesus. But we're not there in our hearts. It's futile thinking, right? Our heart, our relationship needs to be restored. And then Elijah, who restores the altar. Point number one, he restores the relationship. Point number one, restored relationship. Point number two, you with me? He has prepared an offering. Elijah prepares the offering in such a way that only God could light it on fire. He covered it with water, removing all doubt it was God. I mentioned that this is in a moment of drought. And they're on Mount Carmel. So just imagine 3 times he's asking for water to be brought to that location. That's no easy feat when there's no water close by. They're not in a location. They're not in the place where, they're beside the ocean somewhere. I mean, it was a feat to have even brought the water to start with. But he covers the offering to the point where he fills the trench. I mean, it is soaked with water. How many of you ever went camping? How many in this room have gone camping? Some of you, I know some of you are avid campers. One of the things I've discovered that's a real challenge is in camping is when you arrive at a campsite and it's already raining. I don't know if you ever had that experience. And especially those who've really braved it and gone tenting. And so one of the very first things you want, after you set up your tent in the rain, Caleb and I have had this experience. What do you want to do? You want to start a fire. Why? Because you're cold. And you don't want to spend the whole night in your car. So you want to start a fire. But what is the challenge when you're in an environment that doesn't have a nice dry place where they're keeping the firewood, but they just have it heaped up in a pile in some area, and it's raining. What's the problem? Wet wood doesn't burn. Come on. It doesn't burn. At least not very well. No, it doesn't burn. And so this is counterintuitive. If it was me, if I was Elijah and I was wanting to be very practical, I would want dry kindling. I would want to make sure that the whole offering is maybe even been dried out a bit so that, even if a bit of light hits it with the right degree, somehow it could just start to smolder a little bit. You know what I'm talking about? Because you and me, we would prefer to make it happen. We would prefer to be in that space where we could lean into our own gifting, our own ability, our own pizzazz, our own enthusiasm, and somehow pull it off so that it's, whether God comes through or he doesn't come through, it doesn't matter so much. Now, Elijah prepares an offering in such a way that God, unless you come through, this fire isn't being lit. There's going to be no doubt. It wasn't because, well, you hit the afternoon sun and it was already dry, and so things just combust anyway. Sometimes in our lives, because we've played it safe, people around us don't see the power of God at work in us. Because we've played the ground, we've lived a life that's so safe, it's void of the supernatural power of God and what he wants to do in and through us. Because when God does what only he can do through you, the world around you knows it's God. But you and I have to be willing to prepare our lives in such a way that it has to be God. Where we're living in a circumstance or we're putting our faith into practice and we're believing God for the impossible, we can offer ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, that we're dependent upon him to show up in power. This takes courage to put it all on the line, to believe God to do what only he can do. There have been moments along our journey in following God in mission, in just living life as a believer of Christ, where God calls us to trust him. And whenever he calls us to trust him, we're now in a position where he has to come through, because if he doesn't come through, we're in trouble. And yet, when we choose to take the path of least resistance, or we take the easier road, we live a Christianity void of the power of God. And then other things, other gods, other things, other pursuits can take that place. Because it's when we're living in the center of God's grace and his power at work in our lives, life is worth living. You and I were created to be a channel of him flowing through, of him moving in our lives in a way that only he can. He created you for this. But we need to be offering on the table, willing for him to do that. Not resting in our own ability, or only putting ourselves in environments where we can pull it off with or without God. Tell you what, even in churches, as pastors, leaders, we can fall prey to the same thing where, as a church congregation, we will only believe for what we can do. Well, what happens if we have a God-sized dream for our community, for Lloydminster, for the world, for the place around us? What happens if we say, God, here we are. We're available for anything you want to do through us. Set us on fire. What could God do if we put ourselves in that place? Now, the third thing we see, he prepared the offering, but there was fervent prayer. He prayed. Elijah prayed. There are moments when your faith and my faith need to be activated. And it wasn't just a matter of Elijah put it all together and just waited for God. passively, waiting for God to do something. Sometimes as Christians, we can be waiting for God to do something when God is waiting for you to step up. It was God's will for this to happen, but Elijah still needed to pray. He still needed to engage in the process. You see, in our walk with God, He invites us to participate with Him. And how do we participate with God? We pray. We engage in a relationship, and when we are understanding what God's plan is and what His will is, and we pray in accordance to that, we can see God do something supernaturally through that moment, but He invites us to participate, and the participation with God is through prayer. Elijah prayed fervently. He prayed fervently. Verse 37, he said, "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you are a God and you are turning their hearts back again." I don't believe at this moment this was a passive prayer, a mamsy-pamsy prayer, doesn't really matter kind of prayer. He was desperate that God show up in this moment. Just like he prayed that it wouldn't rain. And it didn't rain, but it says he prayed fervently. At this moment, he's praying fervently again for God to show up with fire, to do what only God could do in this moment, so people watching would see that there is only one God. There's a place in our relationship with God that He calls us to seek, to knock, to ask, to be engaged, to believe for the impossible. God, would you come in power in my life? Would you come in power in this circumstance? Lord, would you bring the healing? Lord, would you bring the provision? Lord, would you move in my family? Would you move in my health? Lord, I'm believing, God, because this is what you've called me to. Lord, I'm praying, I'm fervently asking you to do what only you can do. You see, sometimes our prayers are faithless because we're not praying for God to do the impossible. We're praying for the status quo to be maintained, versus believing God to do what only He can do in our circumstances. See, that's the difference of living a life of passive Christianity versus courageous living. Courageous Christianity that says, God, your word says this, your Spirit has spoken to me this, and so I'm going to pray for you to do this because you've spoken it, and I'm putting it all on the line and asking for it to happen. When I look at the world around us, I share this in our week of prayer with the other churches. We are God's answer to our community. God isn't sending somebody else. He's sending you. He's equipped us. He's given us His Spirit. He's called us out as His church to be His representatives, to be His ambassadors. We are God's plan. You are God's plan for your world. There isn't a plan B for Lloydminster but you. I know that's scary. And me. Not just you, it's me too. I'm in it together with you. And what is inspirational about someone like Elijah is he was willing to put his faith on the line and trust in a God who can do the impossible. He was willing to do that. And I think when we look at the world around that we live in, and our families and our finances and our health and all the things that we could be facing right now, could we raise the standard and say, God, what are you saying in my context? What do you want to do? I'm believing in a true God who's able to do what only you can do. And I'm going to pray in agreement with your plan and purposes so that you would do the impossible. We are called to pray for His kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. Well, when I think about that thought process, the kingdom of heaven is pretty cool. It's pretty big. It's perfect. We can be waiting to die to go to heaven, but actually, we're called to bring heaven to earth. We're called to see our environment change because we're believing God to do it. And He invites us to pray. He invites us to be involved in the process because He wants to work with you and through you so that you yourself would discover how good He is, how big He is, how all-powerful He is in your life. And when it comes into question, is it my job, is it my career, is it my family, or is it God? It's God all the time because He's proven Himself over and over again because you put Him in that position of Lord of your life. God responds to the steps Elijah took. And again, sometimes we are waiting for God just to do everything. But there are steps that we have to take in order to see God do what He can do. Again, Elijah prepares the groundwork. He calls on the Lord. He is all in this moment. And then God answers in a moment that He needs to answer. The offering is consumed, the wood, the rocks. I've had some pretty powerful bonfires, but it's never consumed the rocks. Rocks usually don't burn, at least in my experience. Some of you are probably more fire-orientated than me, but that's usually a safe bet that the rocks don't burn. God goes above and beyond. It isn't this little campfire slowly barbecuing the meat that they're going to enjoy later. In a moment, it's gone. It's all gone. The fire consumes everything. I mean, that's pretty incredible fire, isn't it, Brad? I mean, that's a fire hard to put out. Consumes everything. The rocks. Nothing safe in that kind of a fire. The result of this is a nation is impacted and turns back to the Lord. One thing that I find interesting in my own walk and watching people around me, when we get intentional about our following of Jesus, when we get intentional about following Him and being all in, it doesn't just impact your life, it impacts the world around you. It impacts the lives watching you. It impacts the people in your sphere because they just see a display of God in your life and through your life. And it draws people closer to Him because you know what? People around you are also searching for the true God. We live in a world, people may not consider themselves Christians or they may be agnostic or atheist even. The reality is we're all searching for a greater meaning, a greater hope, a greater purpose. And when the chips are down, when you're up against it, when there is a drought in our lives, we're all looking for a God that can answer. And your life may be placed in that moment for people to see the true God working through your life and you be a voice in theirs. And so this morning, God calls us to be that living sacrifice, to be those people that say, God, here am I. I'm willing to be on the altar. Would you set my life ablaze for you? It takes courage to be that. Interesting enough, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, sacrifices were killed. Lambs, bulls. In the New Testament, when we talk about sacrifice, it's living, which means we always have an option to get off the altar. Think about it. You always can get off the altar. A dead bull is dead. It's staying there. But a living sacrifice, as we see in Romans chapter 12, to be a living sacrifice means you can always get off the altar. But it's when we remain on the altar that God can do what He does best through our lives. So I invite you to stand and the worship team to come. I'm not sure where you're at in your journey with God. Maybe this is all foreign. Maybe this is striking a chord in some way or another. But I do believe that you're here on purpose. You're in this building on purpose. You came to church this morning for a reason. You're not just meandering through life and by chance you're here. But God has a plan for you. He has a purpose for your life. He wants to do something extraordinary in you. And this morning, I want to pray for us as a congregation. And you're visiting with us this morning. Hey, happy days. You get to be part of this too. But we want to pray for God to move in us, to be that living sacrifice, that He would come and light our lives on fire for Him. Is that okay? Can I pray that? No, if that's you, I encourage you to agree with me in that prayer. But if it's not you, that's okay. You're still here. God might challenge you on the way home. Who knows?